All right, without further ado, our fifth and final panel, Collaborating for Empowerment. Can our panelists please take their seats? As our panelists are getting seated, I do want to acknowledge and thank another staff person from the mayor's office, Hillary Raftovich. Thank you for helping us with note taking today. It's not the most fun, function, but thank you. So this panel will explore and identify opportunities for intentional collaboration, which the really important word in that sentence is intentional. So it's on the front end, really being sure that we are connecting the dots and really serious about making our systems, governmental and otherwise, work best for us, and us meaning everyone. So we're looking at local, county, state, federal. It's a pretty deep dive, but we must include all of those different agencies and systems so that we're able to at least be mindful of what's missing and what's there, what needs to be added. The other is our functionality as it relates to nonprofit organizations, harm reduction activists, which I've never quite seen, because I think that activists are activists and they tend to go towards those things that people need and are drawn to. In terms of harm reduction activists, I think that would be an interesting thing to look at for us. Also service providers, and also developing a comprehensive plan to empower Annapolitans impacted by the opioid epidemic, and also, as we said in previous panels, not just the opioid epidemic, but substance abuse, substance use. So I bring to you our fifth panel, and I'm going to ask each of you to give a 90-second at most intro as to who you are, how you land at this table, and your thing. So there's that one and this one. You can pass it.
So good afternoon to the survivors of the day.
Right.
Sort of posture going down. I'm Nilesh Kalyana-Raman. I'm the health officer for Anne Arundel County. I'm a primary care doctor, and I've been doing medication-assisted treatment as well for 13 years in community health. So first in DC, in Community Health Center and in the DC jails, and then in Baltimore City, in Baltimore County, and Harford County with healthcare for the homeless. So I've been working with underserved populations for a really long time. It's what I do, and so a lot of the reason that I'm here in Anne Arundel is to look at how we get past the cycle of caring for people after things have happened to them, and how we really push to that prevention piece. How do we not just care for people who have hit hard times, but care for their families, and also implement solutions in communities so that there are fewer people in need in 10, 15, 20 years. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion with the panel. I'm going to hand it to Tricia.
Hi, I'm Tricia Christensen with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. We're a small nonprofit in Baltimore City. Historically, have done a lot of community-based naloxone outreach, and we were doing that before the state really got on board and started providing a lot of those resources. We were the first community-based organization to be doing that in the state. In the last couple of years, we've been growing quite a bit. We're still a pretty small organization with just 3 full-time and 4 part-time employees, but that's 2 years ago. We were 1 paid employee, and it was all volunteer-driven, so it's been really exciting to grow. In that, we were realizing in all of our education advocacy work, we have to get outside of the city. A lot of the policy change that we're looking to do, we have to get support all over the state. So we did establish what we're calling the Maryland Harm Reduction Action Network. Jessie mentioned it earlier. We recruited her last year as just a volunteer who's really passionate in Anne Arundel County about harm reduction. And the idea of this is it's a platform for folks to come together, talk about all of these kinds of interventions for folks. So we're here today, we're talking about treatment, we're talking about prevention. We also have to be talking about harm reduction and how that fits into all of it. I didn't pick anyone else on this panel, but I saw who was with me, and I was like, I met all these guys, I worked with them on all these things, so you guys did good picking all the panel members. So I'm excited for the conversation.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Atzman. I work for the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention. Kind of wearing two hats at the moment. I'm the Director of Justice Reinvestment, which is that big 2016 law that passed. I'm responsible for helping to facilitate and make sure it's implemented properly and managing the grant funds associated with it. And just prior to that, and work I'm still doing is trying to provide additional support for our first responders, especially our police officers around the state, by encouraging the development of police-led diversion or deflection programming, which is how I believe I wound up at this table today. Fortunate enough to have connected with TOLA, and very much looking forward to being able to work with Chief Jackson and folks here in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County on providing some public health backup for our officers, because we all need a little backup, and it's definitely the public health system that is best equipped to tackle addiction-related issues in our communities.
Good afternoon. I'm Ed Jackson. I'm I can still say I'm new, the newly appointed chief. At least I'd like to say that because I like the period that I'm in. The new chief of the Annapolis Police Department. My background is that I was a career Baltimore police commander, retiring in 2004 at the rank of colonel, and I oversaw the administration division at that time. From there, I went on to a 14-year academic career. I was a full-time professor teaching sociology and criminal justice at Baltimore City Community College, and I lectured at most of the local area colleges and universities, Towson University, University of Baltimore, Coppin State, my undergraduate institution. And from there, the journey got interesting when Freddie Gray died in police custody in April of 2015. I was consulted to help out with the police department when they entered into consent decree. The U.S. Justice Department found that the Baltimore police had for decades engaged in unconstitutional policing, and most of it was centered around the drug issues, the drug issues that Baltimore is challenged with from an enforcement end. And I took on the role as Inspector General to make sure that we were in compliance with the 509 paragraphs. I didn't stay around long enough. I don't think they've satisfied one yet. That's another story. But they have 509. And then from there, I was given this wonderful honor to be the chief of police in the city of Annapolis, and what a great city it is. It has its challenges like most American cities. But what's very gratifying being here is that you have a community, a sense of community, unlike many cities. It's not fragmented. Everybody is willing to work together to solve common problems. So that's pretty much who I am and why I'm here. And I'm also delighted. I know everybody on the panel, so this should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So let's get it going. So I do want to apologize to you all because, as you said, Dr. K, this is like the last leg. Like we had, what was it, 250 people in here, probably less than an hour ago. I'm sorry that you all
I would prefer to say that we're the keynote.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you all missed it. We tried to schedule your panel earlier, but it was standing room only. So I have a question that we want to throw out, and I think it's appropriate for who we have on this panel, but also some of what I heard in your introductions, and that is this is about intersectionality, right? And how do, like, on those paths that are crossing, how do we pick up things along the way that can help each of our paths? So to not be so pseudo-intellectual, I'll say, how can city officials, public safety officials, the school system, faith and spiritual communities, private sector, activist community, and other civic groups collaborate for equitable public health access in the city of Annapolis? that was loaded, but I think, and you don't have to deal with each of those pieces, but.
I can start us off. I think the most important thing is that we all get on the same page about what our ultimate goal is. And many different organizations talking about drug use might have some slightly different goals, right? They're like different things we're focusing on. Some people are really focusing on the recovery. Some people are really focusing on preventing drug use to start. I think what we all can agree on, though, is that we don't want people to die.
Right.
So let's start there, right? Let's get a thing that we're all on the same page on. Like the ultimate goal is to prevent overdose fatalities. I'm going to throw out this number because I did the math recently and it's still boggling my mind. The Maryland chief medical examiner, he can tell us exactly when fentanyl came to Maryland. It was at the end of 2013. That was when they started seeing it in the tox reports. That was when we saw a huge spike in overdose fatalities. I crunched the numbers. Since then, more than 10,000 Marylanders have died from an overdose. And I was like, whoa. You know, usually when we get the data, it's all about the most recent numbers, most recent quarter, like maybe it's down a little bit, like cool, like we gotta pat ourselves on the back for the things that we're doing right. But there's still, I mean, it's been a problem for a really long time. And so we all have to get on the same page of the number one goal is to prevent overdose deaths. All of this stigma we're talking about, we have to get over that to really focus on the main goal and then figure out where it is that we can all plug in individually because we have more passion or expertise for separate things.
Thank you.
You know, I would echo that. In my experience, mostly up until my current position with GOCCP, has mostly been working with the BPD and you know, frontline law enforcement and frontline public health practitioners, and bringing two very different disciplines, very different approaches together. The place you start is that common goal, and then you develop a common strategy. And although my career in public service is pretty short, hopefully I have a lot ahead of me, the one constant I've seen is that there is one great strategy, one good public policy consistently to help our vulnerable neighbors, and that's compassion. So if you start with the same organizing goal and the principle of treating everybody with compassion, respect, then that opens up whole areas of collaborative opportunities, and you can develop a common framework where partners that are really used to operating in different environments can start to communicate and collaborate.
Do you want to touch on that?
To build on that, I think the one thing that I think about is that everybody in this room is already interested in this topic, and to build those cross-sector partnerships, we have to listen, and that means we have to listen to the people who are not in this room and be open to what they're saying, and in that space, other people will become open to what we are trying to say in here. And I say that not theoretically. I say that in terms of my own, I guess, journey and growth and learning. Something that I've really thought a lot about is we talk about drugs and we talk about the impact that they have on people's lives and the parallels between drugs and guns. Something that I've been thinking about a lot is that in the same way that drugs aren't going anywhere, neither are guns, right? And yet we have really polarized conversations around those, and oftentimes people are polarized in interesting ways, right? The idea that drugs are here, we don't want to criminalize it, we want to prevent deaths from that, we want to do harm reduction, right? And the folks, and I'm making a real broad generalization here, so don't hold me to it. But those folks, and I include myself, would say, well, we need fewer guns. But if the guns are also here, how do we listen to the people who are quite passionate out there, and they're legal, unlike many drugs, right? How do we listen? And I've had to go through a journey of listening and saying, you know what, maybe I need to be open to a different way of thinking about that. And I think it's in that act of listening that we show that we care. And in being really open to it, not just listening with your ear like this, but listening and being open to those ideas. And that's how we can really build those bridges, because I think a lot about police and public health, and they didn't really occupy the same spaces for a really long time. They still don't occupy the same spaces, but we're moving together, and that can only happen by understanding, from my perspective, understanding what your perspective is, right? Like, what is it that is your objective? What is our objective? And how do we find those commonalities? So I would say listening to the people who are not in this room.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, when we say equitable access, what do we mean by that? What do you all mean when we say equitable access? Anything that comes to mind when we say equitable access?
I'm trying to think of things I've heard throughout the day to capitalize on. But when I think of equitable access, that's really having all of the available options. And that can be tricky sometimes because you have to invest in things and there's funding and resources are always scarce. But there are many different ways for individuals to access care. And that can look like 12-step meetings. That can look like a medication-assisted treatment program. One thing that we advocate for is overdose prevention sites, safe consumption spaces, was mentioned earlier. That's a place where we're not asking you to stop using drugs at this time, but it's still a way of bringing people into care and saying, you know what, we love you, we care about you, we want you to stay alive. And this is another way to bring people in, build those relationships. The idea of it is to be non-judgmental. And I think that going into it with the compassion and the non-judgmental approach is what creates that equitable care for folks.
Okay.
And I know as a policeman, equitable access means to me is that everybody has the ability to get treatment on demand, that the same opportunities that are available when the wealthy are struggling with substance abuse, that poor people in marginalized communities, underserved communities have the same access to treatment and all the other wraparound services that one would have to have. I heard the previous panel talk about the aftercare and treating the whole person as opposed to just the addiction. And so for me, equitable access means that everybody, whether you live in Eastport or Woodside Gardens, everybody who is struggling can have a resource available to them to get them the type of treatment.
Okay, we're going to quote you on that. Okay, wow, powerful, please.
You know, what the chief said really hits home.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate, equity is really having this playing field where everybody can get access to the same high quality services, and it has to come with the recognition that our most vulnerable neighbors in the community can't access services the way we can at this table or we can in this room. There are immense barriers, be them transportation, be them racism, lack of housing, if you're a person experiencing homelessness, that can prevent you from just making that normal doctor's appointment. There could be so much more wrapped up in that. And that if we really want equitable access, then for some people we need to put in more effort. Like Nilesh said, we need to make sure we're making the effort to hear and serve them.
Yes.
Which is really going out into the community in a much more focused, determined way than we historically have to make sure that no one's left behind. Because otherwise, it's our EMS crews and it's our police officers who are then having interactions because these are individuals who have been left behind. If not for that interaction with a first responder, they might not be able to get any care.
That's right.
Wow. Thank you. There are points in that in all that you all have brought up that we've talked about throughout the course of the day, which makes it even more powerful, because this feels like it's not only we're talking about collaboration, but it's the culmination of our day. So I thank you all for that, and I want to I want to touch on some of the things I heard you all say about breaking the stigma, which happens to be, I don't know if you saw it on the sign back there, but that happens to be one of the things that, like subconsciously saw it, but one of the things is, that's something that part of the opioid epidemic has brought to a city like Annapolis, right? Which is already kind of embedded in a little bit of history related to the military and related to the way you're supposed to be and supposed to look. And so we have marginalized communities that that level of stigma is triple dangerous, right? Because they're already locked out of systems. And so we've been doing a lot of work. Tola came up with NAM, which is a large part of this. So it's really good to hear that approach coming from you all. Now I'm going to switch gears to something that it could be a lightning rod, but this is talking about Big Pharma and some of the lawsuits, right? And so the idea that as more of these lawsuits are being settled on the national level, nationally, and the city could potentially receive a payout or a settlement for damages caused by overprescribing of powerful opioid narcotics. What mechanism, this is looking at the back end, and let's say that does happen, what mechanisms and systems can be put into place to ensure that the most vulnerable and impacted communities could receive the treatment and are empowered equitably with restorative justice in relation to looking at it through that lens and enabling those communities to get what they need out of that to move the needle on their issues. Do you all have any ideas around that?
I have plenty of ideas around that. It's frustrating. I've been in this business of law enforcement since 1982, either as an academic or practitioner. And it took me years to realize the bigger conspiracy, if you will. On one hand, we put all this poison out there and we over-medicate people, and on the other hand, we want to, when they become addicts, if you will, then we want to criminalize them. I know of many cases as a policeman, when you really get to the core of why a person's an addict, a lot of times it simply started out when they were prescribed medicine. And the medicine, for whatever reason, especially a narcotic, they just became addicted. And then not being able to get access to treatment caused them to go to the black market, and therein lies this enforcement piece. Right. And we have people who are sitting in jails and prisons all over this country, in Maryland as well, all over this country, who shouldn't be there. If there was true public safety involved and true justice. You know, it's one thing to have criminal justice, but we often equate the word justice with criminal justice, but there's social justice, there's economic justice, and in addition to criminal justice. And so, you know, without the other two, you're going to have a dysfunctional criminal justice system. And so to answer your question, I think that the way you empower the community, I want to do a lecture series, because there's so many topics that are mystified to the community. If you don't explain to the community and demystify what you do, then they will interpret it the way they see it, and how they see it versus how it is. And then have the courage, and this is what we struggle with in America, have the courage to say, I was wrong. Right. You know, so many people will cause more damage because they'll stick to something dysfunctional or something that did more harm, speaking of harm reduction than good, and they'll stick with it politically because they don't want to have the courage, or they lack the moral courage to say, we, I, me, he, she was wrong.
Right. Thank you.
So this is a really important question, because there's two threads to that. There's the big pharma threat, but then there's also the issue with heroin for many decades, right? And the role that drugs and redlining and criminalization of drug use have played in minority, particularly African American communities, and what do you do with those dollars that eventually come from pharma? That addresses one piece of that the damage that has been done by opioids, but it doesn't address all of what's been done. And so thinking of it from a health equity perspective of what is it that people need, I think it's a challenging question, and it's not one that I think that we answer in isolation, but we engage with communities and we say, what is it that you need, and how do we put the resources to where the need is greatest right now? Because there are different historical patterns that have led us to this moment right now. Some much longer standing than others. And to your point, the prescription opioid crisis also is overlaid on growing income inequality and how it interplays with that. And all these threads come together. And I hope that we're not in a place where people are fighting for resources, but where we're collaborating to send them to provide those resources to the places that need it.
The question reminded me of a saying. I'm fortunate enough to have a few friends who are a little bit older and wiser than I am. And I frequently heard them say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we need inclusive processes, especially when we're talking about government function. What we do in our bureaucracies is not always transparent, it's not always clear, and it can be really hard to understand. And it's incumbent on all of us, and also incumbent on you to hold us accountable to be doing this, to open those doors, make sure our discussions are inclusive. And it might not be appropriate in every situation, but there are some mechanisms that have been used elsewhere that can help us better distribute resources according to the needs of the community, participatory budgeting processes and whatnot. But I think that saying, especially now when we're talking about, this potential windfall from litigation and whatnot, seems particularly relevant.
I just want to take this moment to just say for a moment that this whole narrative about pharmaceutical companies being the cause of our current overdose epidemic is really underwhelming. It certainly plays a piece. We know there are some people who they started using pharmaceutical drugs and they got that physical dependence, and then that turned into an addiction. As my friend Jesse Dunleavy loves to say, dependence and addiction are different things. There are plenty of people that become physically dependent on a substance, but then they're able to medically wean down and they are just fine. Not everyone who receives a prescription for oxycodone becomes addicted to opioids. Just want to make that very clear. However, in this moment where pharmaceutical companies are going to give some money out, like I will take your money, what can we do with it, right? The Maryland General Assembly passed legislation last year, or earlier this year in 2019, the Opioid Restitution Fund. And it was based on something many years ago called the Tobacco Restitution Fund, the idea being these big companies are being sued, we're gonna get some money from them, let's make sure it's going to the right place, right? We don't wanna just put it into the roads construction necessarily, like how can we use it to address the problems that it was connected to? And in that legislation, it outlines a few specific things that the money could be used toward. One thing I know with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition and our advocacy is that we really advocated to broaden the language slightly, because the language was saying to be used for like opioid-related programs, blah, 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 blah. And we said, well, can we broaden that to say drug overdose related or just overdose related? Because we don't know when that money is going to arrive. It might still be a few years down the road. And we don't know if opioids is still going to be the problem. We just don't. If you look historically at in the whole country, our overdose rates have been increasing exponentially before opioids were really on the scene, even before the prescription opioid wave. So it's a drug overdose epidemic or syndemic, if we want to get epidemiologically technical, for my public health people in the room. And so we don't know what's coming next. In some states, they're seeing a huge increase in methamphetamine use and overdoses related to it. Some of that is related to fentanyl tainting, which I guess is technically still opioid related, but we don't know exactly where it's going. And so when you're thinking about that kind of advocacy, trying to think ahead and not tying ourselves to the current epidemic that we're already very behind on, and thinking ahead, how can we use these resources down the line and not tying ourselves or blinding ourselves to the current issue.
Right, so thank you. For example, in California, I used to, for 7 years, I worked for the Prop 10 Commission. I don't know if you all ever heard of that, but it's loosely coined First Five LA or First Five California. And it comes out of big tobacco. So that's settlement, right? The master settlement. And their endowment was $1 billion a year. Just the county of Los Angeles, which is a lot of people, millions of people. But and they operated off the interest. So there's a large part of that in states like Maryland where they can't put things on the ballot because they had a proposition that the citizens put on the ballot. So let's say we do receive a settlement, or I even look at it in terms of like medical marijuana and us having dispensaries and being able to sell that. Like the idea that it's privatized to that degree, and which means none of that money from any of the suffering caused by any of the people who were arrested and put in jail for petty crime or whatever, and I don't want to get into that, but it's not sustainable. So I hear you on that. In California, what they did is they took that money and directly said, we are going to provide it not just for services directly related to the harm that tobacco caused, but now is our chance to talk about infant mortality, early learning, universal preschool, prenatal health, all of that stuff, right? So it's something for us to look at because we can get to some of those other areas. So the last thing I wanted to ask, we had questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask one more. Actually, let me get to the question in the audience because my questions tend to be labyrinth.
So hello, I have a question for the health officer. So in lieu of all the opioid issues that are going on in our county and our city, what can we do to take away the barriers from individuals that are qualified to help with treatment?
So tell me what you're specifically referring to.
I'm specifically talking about two things: peer support.
Mm-hmm.
How can we take away the barrier of not having a license to be a peer support? Because we have people who are qualified and who can do the work, but the requirement is that you have a license. So how can we take away that barrier to get people employed to help people who can effectively help?
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that it isn't a requirement yet, but it is a certification actually, and that has to do with payment, honestly.
No, not license, not the certification license, driver's license. Yes, not the certification license,
Got it.
driver's license. So you can qualify to be a peer support, but not having a driver's license will cash you out from being a peer support. That's what I was told.
An ID or a driver's license?
A driver's license. That was what I was told from the county.
We should probably talk offline because
Okay.
that's news to me. I know you need an ID, but a driver's license, that might be a particular job requirement for a particular job. So I don't know, let's talk afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we have another question. Yes, ma'am.
Let me just respond to that a little bit, Tony. One of the things, Dr. Milish, is that you have to be in recovery. You have had to be in recovery. You had to use and be in recovery for the last 3 years, I believe it is. But the driver's license piece is because we have peer support at our clubhouses. It's because they have to travel and get to the different locations. And I don't think that's a disqualifier at this point. I think the biggest thing is that you had to have had 3 years in recovery and not using for 3 years. But you can verify that, okay? Thank you.
I have a question.
Who's it? Right here.
Thanks, Pastor.
You're welcome. My angel.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and bringing it in, right? Bringing us home for the end of the day. Because for those of us that have been here, it's been a long day, but it's been really informative and it's just been really good. I heard the question at some point, maybe it was here, maybe it was before, how do we bring us all together, right? So what I'm looking at right here, what I've looked at in this room all day, is the state has been here, the county has been here, the city is hosting, city has been here. you've got faith-based, you've got community-based, you've got nonprofit, right? So we're all in the room. I am the coordinator for Recovery Anne Arundel, which is a coalition. We work primarily at the county level, right? We hold our meetings in the county, but that does not make it specific to the county because we also host the annual recovery walk right here in the city. We've done that for 8 years. So my question is, monthly, we have 50 people that come every single month. So if Recovery Anne Arundel were to bring those meetings into the city, would each and every person that's either been here today or representation from the government, would you be a part of that? Because I believe that, I said this earlier today, I believe that we have very different problems here in the city than we do in the county. I personally have had, I've had conversations with Kevin Simmons, and like, I get it. Overdose numbers are down countywide, thank God. Fatals are down countywide, thank God. But the city, I've watched the spike in the city go up, and to me, that is frightening. So my question is, would everybody be invested in coming to that meeting? Would the city be invested, which I think it's yes, in hosting some of those meetings right here in the city, because we need to get more city buy-in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Do you want me to just hold this, or do you have?
Well, I'll add. So how many of you remember the Healthy Anne Arundel Coalition? It's been a few years. I'll leave it at that. It's been a few years. What I think was powerful about that was that it did bring people together, but what I think was missing is it didn't bring the community members together. So when you're talking about whether it's community-based organizations, not the nonprofits, but community representation, faith-based, whatever, non-professional representation, didn't have that. So we're bringing Healthy Anne Arundel Coalition back in January. And we're working very hard to make sure that there's representation from all the communities from across the county. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've been learning about is that there are a lot of communities, and if you're off on 97, the volume goes down drastically, right? If you're somewhere in the Brooklyn Park, Glen Burnie to Annapolis corridor, we can hear your voices better than if you're in Severn or in Deal or in Pasadena. And so part of it is making sure that everybody's voices are heard. So I can't speak to the Annapolis piece. Certainly that's a part of it, but I can't speak to the county piece, of which Annapolis is an absolutely critical part of it, right? Is that we want to bring everybody together to determine the health priorities. This is obviously one of them. I don't have to tell you that, you can say that. And you are by being here. But to determine the priorities and to work on them together. So everybody in this room, you'll be hearing more in the next few weeks as we get our details together, but we're looking for a late January relaunch date for that.
So I as much as I want to, I'm going to stay piggybacking off of what you said, because that is something that's much needed. I mean, that is a huge gap that we do have. That we're having interjurisdictional meetings right now at various levels between county and city, but it's needed for everything, for all services, anything that intersects. But we'll get to that. The question we did have along in the same lane as that is there's a lot of talk about smart cities, technology, obviously information sharing, which we have to do whether we want to or not, but also developing more efficient and sustainable ways of kind of connecting with each other. Now let's relate it to services, right? What are some ideas you all have about how we can streamline our systems and kind of work together a little bit more to deliver better services? And the second part of that, which you can get to if you'd like, is as it relates also to treatment and people that are recovering again. Like, how do we connect them to those services? And you don't have to answer that question. It's not a Cool question.
I've become a big fan of fusion centers, and for my Office of Emergency Management people in the room, I don't see Kevin Simmons, but what fusion centers do, mainly natural disasters or terrorist attacks, it brings a multidisciplinary approach to stabilize or diminish the threat altogether.
Okay.
And I just said last night to one of my commanders that I would love to organize or work with the Office of the Mayor and get the Mayor's permission to spearhead a summit in 2020 where we bring the entire city of Annapolis together, all agencies, and lay out its problems. At the core of it is drugs and violence, and just let me backtrack a little bit, because we're ever going to get past it, we got to do two things in my opinion. We got to know the history, how we got here, so we're not destined to repeat its mistakes. And we have to have the courage to understand that a lot of this mess, for lack of a more scholarly word, that we're in is a result of the politics in America at the federal level. We got into this drug problem. I'm a spokesperson for Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and it's a consortium of police executives throughout America who advocate for drug reform. And so we've waged this war, the so-called war on drugs. It's been almost a 50-year, very useless, very destructive war on drugs in America, and we've damaged lives, we've ruined lives, and we've divided the community. And I won't get into it because I know in the interest of time, but it goes back to the Nixon administration, right after the Civil Rights Movement.
We can have a separate, believe me, if you want, we can have a separate summit about
It
that.
needs to be said, it needs to be talked about, but back in the late 60s, early 70s, the President of the United States waged war on drugs, and really it wasn't war on drugs, that's a code word for waging war on his dissenters.
Yeah.
And during the psychedelic movement and many of these, the hippie movement, they were intellectuals. They weren't just street people. They had PhDs and medical degrees and law degrees from some of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in America. They were critical of the policies, mainly Vietnam, foreign policy. And so they co-opted local law enforcement into believing that this very rigid line was drawn, and if you were involved in drugs, you were evil. And if you stayed away from drugs, you were good. It sounds rather novel nowadays because we're far more enlightened as a society to realize that that addiction or dependency is the disease. And the disease comes from two components. This means not at ease. Put them together, you have disease. But yet we still struggle with the enforcement component. And I want my men and women here in Annapolis, while however long I have the opportunity to head it, is to look at drug enforcement in a different way. We have to solve the problems, not perpetuate it through enforcement. So we have to have strategies that come together and learn from other disciplines. The day where the cop is just focused on walking a beat and has the basic codes or state laws and cross them blindly over with, the community expects us to have the social skills and the analytical skills to identify problems and work through it. Right. And I think that's what our role should be. So to answer your question, I would love to see a multidisciplinary approach, actual fusion centers where people can come and then we're involved. I say we, the law enforcement community is involved, and we demystify and educate our officers to solve these problems. So out of that can come advocacy, because the elephant in the room is the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration is the biggest cog in this wheel. As long as they keep with these Schedule I drugs, classifying these Schedule Is and being so rigid in federal law, it hampers the ability of local and state law enforcement officials to approach the drug problem differently. So I hope I answered the question. I got a little bit about how I was, but I'm passionate about that.
Well, I'm just going to riff off of you now. I don't remember what the original question was. But,
It was.
I'll do them
Name
all.
5 things you.
I think I have a way to connect it back. all day long, and every time we're in these rooms together, we're talking about stigma, right? And reducing the stigma and anti-stigma campaigns and what can we do? We can't destigmatize people who use drugs while we're still criminalizing them. Hands down. And some of that is federal, 100%, and there's a huge problem with that. But there's a lot we can do at the local level. A lot of cities around the country have deprioritized drug possession charges, right? So that's just within the police department making it a personal policy, the deprioritizing. Our state's attorney in Baltimore City, Maryland Mosby, has made it a policy that she will not prosecute any cannabis possession charges. So the police are still arresting people, but they're not prosecuting it. So at least they're finally like, okay, I guess we should stop arresting people. This is a waste of our time. Like, that wasn't, the police weren't gonna make the change, so the prosecutor's like, okay, well, like, I'm gonna make a change. So there are many different levels where we can be advocating for decriminalization. And we'll do a quick promotion that we're pushing a bill in 2020 to decriminalize the possession of drug paraphernalia. And the idea there is like, we don't criminalize drugs, right? Drugs aren't criminalized, it's possession of drugs. Same with paraphernalia. If someone's holding a syringe, that in and of itself is not a crime, but as soon as there's an intention to be using that syringe to use drugs, it's a crime. We in Maryland have syringe service programs in a lot of places which exempt people, but law enforcement is still very confused about who now is considered a criminal and who is not. So let's just change that law then, let's make it less confusing. So there are some things we can do at the local and the state level, is my real point.
Yeah, but I think that the police chief has to come out, because you're right. Merlin Mosby said something that I thought was very powerful, but you had the police commissioner of Baltimore City to come right behind and say, well, as long as it's in the books, as long as the Maryland General Assembly says that the possession of anything over 10 grams is still illegal, then my officers are going to enforce it. And I think that's where the criminal justice system needs to come together and come to some kind of consensus to change, to advocate to change state law. Because then what happens, the officers arrest them, and if it's the state law says you're anything more than 10 grams, and say the officer acted, just pretend with me that the officer acted constitutionally and was able to seize those drugs in accordance to the Constitution, then we're at a dilemma. And so we have to, those fusion centers that I just described, we not only do the care piece, but then we have to change have the laws change, because the laws are supposed to be the people's will. And we have so many laws that doesn't reflect community values, and that's a problem, because that undermines this whole idea of democracy. We're supposed to be servants and do the people's will, and we still have these rigid drug laws, and that's another agenda. We have people with a vested interest who want to see these things continue politically.
Yeah.
We have so many people who want to see our prisons healthy with people in them. And they want to see it, because it's a moneymaker. The elephant in the room is a moneymaker. And I'm a police chief saying that, but it's the truth. It's a moneymaker. And so you have people who will fight you tooth and nail, and we have to identify who those people are and hold them accountable to at least engage us in the debate so that we can work towards making the argument as to why we need to change these systems that we have in place.
All right, thank you all so much. Do you have?
Yeah,
sorry.
Briefly, the chief, I think, brought it home well. And if I recall, the original question was something about making our public systems more efficient,
No.
which is, it wasn't?
It was like, name your favorite.
My favorite animal?
I mean, I don't know where you came up with that.
Well, you can't blame a bureaucrat for thinking like a good bureaucrat. But that really brings it home if you think about where do we get the biggest bang our buck for taxpayers, which is really what motivates a lot of conversations around government policy. All we have to do is look at the science. The Les right here used to work for Healthcare for the Homeless, so I know I'm definitely preaching to the choir. If you want to address homelessness, the most cost-effective, compassionate, humane thing to do, but also, again, the best use of public resources is to just give people a home. If we want to address substance use disorders and behavioral health care, the most cost-effective and also in terms of getting effective outcomes for the individuals involved is to provide people the compassionate, non-judgmental care they need, not put them in the criminal justice system. So I think we just need to look at the science and reground ourselves in the facts. And that is the path forward that at least, we're trying to look to as a way to improve practice and help bring people together again around those shared goals and shared understanding.
Okay, so I wanna do a time check, because it's after 4, and we had promised everyone that we would be out by 4. If I let you all ask your questions, will it be brief? Which negates everything I just said. I'm the best monitor on earth. I think. Okay, you can ask your question from. Are you okay asking from where you are?
I'm right here. Thank you, Chief. I've been trying to meet you, so I'm glad you're here. And Dr. Millesh, so these are both of my questions to you. Maryland has the highest incarceration rate out of any state in the United States of America. That is a concern. However, Dr. Millesh, I'm happy to hear that you and our county executive are doing something about making racism a mental health issue. And I'm saying all that because everyone knows in here that ACEs it's a big thing for me. So, and they're adding to ACEs discrimination as one of the causes for ACE. How does that fit into what your plan, if I'm making any sense, how does that fit into both of your plans? Because a lot of our African Americans, and of course, Chief, you're familiar with disproportionality of minorities in the criminal justice system. So how does that fit in, those two components, to what we're going to do, incarceration of our inmates? Is that short enough, Mr. Owen?
I'm going to give you the 30-second version of the 5-minute answer that I would normally give, which is to say that yes, we have declared racism as a public health issue, and that means something very specific, and it's bringing together two different ideas. One is the issue of the structural issues that have led to frankly racist outcomes in terms of health disparities and how they've been perpetuated for decades. And we have numerous examples of those. We know that the health department put out a report this summer, just our first stab at that, and there's more coming in terms of looking at that. But that's one piece of it. The other is those overt acts of racism, and that's a little bit of a different issue. But there's still ways to address that. And when we talk about it as a public health issue, it means a very specific way of looking at it, looking at data, looking at why it's happening, what's protective of it, how do we address that in our communities collaboratively? And to that end, in the health department, we are standing up an Office of Health Equity and Racial Justice to address this. We'll be looking at this at a county-wide level, how we're looking at any legislation that we're looking at, what are the health impacts and what are the racial equity impacts in it. From a health standpoint, what are the programs and collaborations we need to look at that. That was more than 30 seconds. I'm going to skip the ACEs part and hand over to the Chief.
Well, I don't have much more to say. Dr. K and I met for coffee yesterday, and that was part of our conversation to be more collaborative. But one of the things I'm going to do, and I've done, is use my platform as the Chief of Annapolis Police to re-socialize how we approach things. And I still have a ways to go. I've only been here 3 months. And so I'm looking at the numbers and how we approach it. Because you're right, as Eisenhower coined it, Eisenhower used the term military-industrial complex in 1960. And he talked about the, people using war as a way to generate revenue. What a lot of Americans don't know is that, and it lines up directly with racism, that prisons are privatized now. You can trade on the NASDAQ, and so I believe it was Angela Davis who coined the term prison industrial complex, where the privatization of prisons, in order for it to be private and in our capitalistic approach. I know this is very controversial to some people, especially people with traditional law enforcement mindset, but you have to incarcerate in order for it to be profitable. Does that make sense? Yes. If you don't have people to put them in there, like you say in economics, if you don't have the widgets, and the widgets are African American and Latino men primarily, It's even poor whites. It's not just blacks and Latinos, it's poor whites. It's anybody who really doesn't have an advocate and they don't have access to a good legal defense. And so we target those people, we target the behaviors, the social problems, and we make them criminal problems. Does that make sense? And then that accounts for the mass incarceration, because the elephant in the room is that most of what we respond to as law enforcement officials are not crime problems. They're social problems that manifested itself in poor behavior. And then our government trains us or challenges us to eradicate these problems by incarceration. And so the average cop that goes to responds to a 911 call for a domestic dispute, they're trained to eradicate it, you know. And the problem with that is that we often respond to calls for service to address issues that's gone on for generations. It's no way that an officer is going to go into an environment and to try to solve problems that have been occurring for generations: mental illness, alcoholism, clinical depression, a lack of access to capital, not eating the right foods. All that manifests itself in behavior. But the elephant in the room is that we pretend that people are motivated by an angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. Whoever makes the most compelling argument determines the behavior. That's a bunch of crap. Crime is the result of the socialization process. And so we need a police executive who's going to tell his men and women, we need you to problem solve. Now, don't get me wrong. I'll say this and then I'll shut up. But I'm all for peace. I'm all for the preservation of life. So before you have a conversation with me about anything else, I'll tell you the number one on my agenda is the preservation of life. You can come back from most things, but if somebody takes your life, you can't come back. And so what my challenge is, or it should be the challenge of every police executive in America, to put violence reduction at the forefront. And I think if you put violence reduction and you have good comprehensive strategies to deal with the violence collaboratively, not try to do it ourselves, to have the partners up at the table to work with us, then you'll see a whole lot of the other problems like drug addiction and drug dependency and mental health issues diminish greatly. It'll never be utopia, but right now we're dystopia, and so we need to work take a multidisciplinary approach to solve those problems.
All right, thank you. So without further ado, is it okay if we begin the closeout? Are you all okay with that?
Can I ask my question?
Yes, that's why. Okay.
Thank you. Thank
Should bring us
you.
to action.
I believe in data and scientific findings, and I know that most people are motivated by that. There may be some things we don't know, but we learn. We're committed to that. And I've read studies done in just the past year, really in-depth abstract studies that are a little over my head and getting through some of it, but one done by Harvard Medical School and Mass General together to look at what can we do to predict that we'll be able to save lives. As Tricia said, that's what we all want. Every one of us can join hands and agree to that. And the outcome of that particular study was that continuing to reduce prescription drugs would probably have about a 2% effect on future deaths. But the main things that the country needs to do is catch up with other countries in some ways, but we need to put more emphasis on harm reduction services and more emphasis on medication for treatment. Not to say that it's for everybody, nobody thinks it's for everybody, but it's an option, and we need to have that be a more viable option. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine did a similar study this year, and they didn't focus as much on the on the harm reduction as they did the medication-assisted treatment. But we have a day like this where people are all ears and eager to learn and move forward, and we don't come into the room thinking we're all going to agree on everything, but basically we have more in common than we don't. But we can have one of our panelists say that there's no place for drugs in the treatment of drug use. And so that flies in the face of all of the science and all of the research. And it affects what people walk away from here understanding, because one person says one thing and another says another. And that's discouraging. And I don't know how we better promote what the science is telling us. It's there.
What's your question, Jesse?
I don't know. I'm not sure if that was a question, but I feel obliged to answer it because we populated panels, and I'll tell you the purpose of having a panel is for us is never. The goal isn't to have everyone agree to the exact same thing. And it definitely isn't to have everyone adhere to the exact same scientific findings, which I think is really hard.
I'd like to see the science that says there's no place for drugs in drug treatment.
But I will say that a person who says that is entitled for them to, that's a statement that they are making as an individual. They're not representing like the scientific community.
No, my question really was, what do we do to promote scientific evidence so that we're not dependent on just the he said, she said,
Right.
you know, because
Well, it's almost like we're gonna take a real deep dive, but I'm not gonna go too deep down, it's almost like the conversation about spirituality and religion. Because it is not up for me to tell someone what like their truth is. So some people adhere and view science as like the absolute, like that is the standard. And some people are going off of their lived experiences or their visceral reaction to something. So they don't necessarily, I mean, one could say science contradicts with people who believe in an aspect of like religion, right? Or organized religion. So that's a conversation that I can't mainline myself as a moderator. I think the beauty of it is one person may say, I adhere more to the science and these findings, and then the other person may say this doesn't feel right. It feels like it should be this way, but that I don't know.
But when saving lives are on the line.
Right. I will say that.
If I may.
Yes, please.
I want to keep it super short. So I've been involved in substance use treatment for a long time. There's two main ways of change, or one, people who are open to change, and two, you train a new generation. So we all have our ideas, and I suspect that panel disagrees with you, right? So, instead of getting in a clash. But I think the second piece of it is that different treatment paradigms work for different people, and there are absolutely some people who believe it, like, I don't have anything in my body. That's fine, I think your point is, how do we keep all those options available, right?
Most everybody I talk with knows that there are options that aren't right.
And I think that's one of the things that we focus on from the health department is how do we cap all of those options as part of the recovery spectrum. So we continue to push to make sure that there's a range of options available for everybody.
Right.
And the one thing that I always take away from the science, and I think you're hearing this from all of us up here now, is the complexity. So like Chief just said, you have to recognize the nuance and the humanity in every situation and be able to creatively problem solve with as big of a toolbox as possible. And there is no black and white. So just like recovery is a spectrum, the action a first responder can take at a scene with their discretion offers a spectrum of options in a lot of circumstances. We need to offer as a public spectrum of recovery choices for individuals, and that's really the key. Like, these are incredibly complex issues, and we're dealing with incredibly complex people. So there is no one size fits all, and certainly MAT and even some drug use can be part of someone's continuing path to recovery, and it's on that individual to define that on their own terms.
I agree.
Thank you all so much, and I really appreciate you all's time, and thank you for that question. Absolutely. Hey.
History serves us best to understand any possible question that we have. To get to the truth, you cannot avoid history. Thank you, Chief, for bringing up the history. But here we are, school to prison pipeline. There's some people, some politicians, some governments in this society that want to hold on to the history. They don't want it to change. So here we are again, and it does repeat itself. If you live as long as I have, you can see it repeating itself. Thank you.
All right, so we do have an announcement that we'd like to make.
You prepared to do so?
Are you looking at me?
Yeah. Can you say that?
Oh, okay, so Tola's going to put me on the spot, and I was just chatting with the chief and Alesh. I suspect we're going to have the opportunity to work with your office soon on this as well. Several weeks ago, we found out that the governor's office, our office, won a large federal grant to do law enforcement assisted diversion or police-led diversion across 9 sites in the state of Maryland, and really happy to share that Annapolis is one of those sites. So starting early next year, we'll start bringing together a group of stakeholders, an inclusive group of community members and government agencies to really plan an intervention that will work best for the city. And I'm particularly excited about the program because it gives us a lot of flexibility. So it's really just our office providing some support and resources to the city to make something that really works best here. And the city of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County is a fantastic place to do this work because you already have so many great services to build off of. You have this fantastic infrastructure. You have so many great people, so many great partners in the faith community, the recovery community. I am so excited for this work next year. And I saw my friend Steve Thomas was on the agenda earlier today from the Anne Arundel County Police. They're doing great work. The existing partnerships are phenomenal. So I really expect some real magic to happen, and I would advise you all to stay tuned.
All right, thank you all. And the last thing is, this is our final speech.
Chief Jackson, could you speak a little bit about lead and law enforcement diversion?
Real quick.
Yes, first of all, I'm working with harm reduction in Baltimore City, and as a spokesperson for LEAP and LEAD, we're doing a lot of interesting things. I don't know what you just want me to define it, or what's that? LEAD?
The lead.
The lead.
General.
Help me out, Amy.
Yeah, so law enforcement, LEAD stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. That's kind of the brand name that a lot of jurisdictions are using. I'd encourage everybody here to think of something that works for Annapolis. But essentially, it gives the officers a new tool at the point of arrest where in lieu of booking and incarceration for certain low-level offenses, officers can easily deflect that individual back to the public health system to get whatever care and support they need. This could be if an individual has a behavioral health condition that might be underlying the offense, or a social service need. In addition to the arrest referral pathway, most LEAD programs also have a social contact referral pathway where if a first responder comes, as the course of their daily duty comes across someone who's vulnerable and needs a hand, this is literally a tool that's a phone call away, and then the public health system responds within minutes, saves incredible officer resources, and obviously this is all in lieu of criminal justice system involvement.
And also, the last component of that, I couldn't define it, I had a brain freeze, but also we're working with, and Amy, I need you, she's sitting back there, we're working now to not only, what's important about this, not enter them into the criminal justice system. We're getting ready to partner, and I'm going to sign an MOU with Anne Arundel County Police Department, not the police department, Anne Arundel County Corrections. They're going to book out prisoners. But one of the things that I don't want to happen is that precisely that, as a part of our diversion program, for those things that we may give them some other opportunity in lieu of charges, like a citation. As it stands now, we're booking everybody for everything. What I'm working on now is to keep people out of the criminal justice system in its entirety, because you don't have a real LEAD program if you're still booking people. And to make a long story short, is every time somebody comes into custody by policy, we have to ident them. And so one of the compromises is that we just ident them just for the purpose of making sure that for liability purposes, if they came into our custody, that they're who they say they are. And so when we do the paperwork, we have the right person. What I don't want to happen is to automatically criminalize them and enter into the criminal justice system by booking them, because then that gives them a record. That's another charge that goes to the criminal justice information system. So that's a part of the LEAD program too, is to work towards not entering into the system, period. Thank you for helping me out.
Of course. Okay, and we need to go. I tried to figure out a way of buttering it up. I'm like, we just need to get out of here. There's a wedding that's coming in right now. But seriously, we have one. I have one final question, and this is for a prize of one of our NAM shirts, which stands for Naptown. Naptown being you all know Naptown is the name they call it. It's like a nickname for Annapolis, and anti-dope movement is a outreach thing. We have T-shirts that if you see on the signs, people wore them all during the summer, and it's a pretty hot item. So I'm being serious. So, but in order to get one of those shirts, I need to know there's a level that you need to reach by the questions that each of you give to the answer to this question. So name a famous wizard.
Who's involved? Harry Potter.
Hold on. Everybody gets one. Name a famous wizard.
Who's involved?
Okay. He's showing his age.
Harry.
You said Harry Potter?
Late career Michael Jordan.
That's really good. Okay. So Chief, did you have one?
Me?
Oh! Okay. So number one, 37 people said Harry Potter. So Harry Potter is the winner. Merlin, who said Merlin?
I said Merlin.
Yeah, I didn't even. I thought that was like a baseball team or something. And who else? Was it of Oz?
Yeah.
That was further down the list. And what was someone else's answer up there? Harry Potter was number one. Number two was Merlin. Number three was Gandalf. And then Doctor Strange was 4. Wizard of Oz was 5. Voldemort. Voldemort. And then Newt Scamander? Newt Scamander? I can't read. It's something I don't tell people. Thank you all so very much. Just remember, even though we ended it off, rather lightly, remember we tackled a serious subject today, and I appreciate all of you all that stuck around since 8:30 this morning. Thank you all very much. Thank you, panelists. And remember, you'll get a report with all of the recommendations in it after it goes to our city internal affairs. Then we'll get to it. Thank you.